If you're a student loan borrower, should you rent or should you buy a house? So we know that having student loan debt in the first place slows you down from buying a house. We have that just repeated to us over and over again in surveys that we've done in studentloanplanner.com readers. So let's talk about the case for home ownership. Home ownership can be a great thing. It gives you psychic benefits. It enables you to not have to move around every couple of years. You have tax benefits with the mortgage interest deduction that you could qualify for. Some people can still deduct property taxes as well, up to $10,000 total. So there's all these benefits of also having an appreciating asset and building equity. So there's an interesting case to be made for homeownership. Certainly during the pandemic, the prices of homes have, gone to the moon, right? Because there's been a big lack of housing available for people that are willing to sell, and the demand for housing has been far more because everybody wants space. Everybody wants to stretch their arms and not have to get right up in somebody's business living in 500 square feet in the city during a pandemic, which makes a lot of sense. So you've seen suburbs and exurbs really soar, especially relative to the prices in cities. So that's the case around home ownership in general. Let's talk about home ownership pros and cons. So pros are you can have increase in price. You can get the benefit of having your own space to do what you want with it. You have more permanence. You have a little bit more stability. You feel like you're actually part of a community instead of just temporarily there. Those are some of the pros. Some of the cons are that you have to plan on significant maintenance expenses. A lot of these expenses can be front loaded. So you move into a home, especially an older home, and there's all these things that you didn't pick up on in the inspection report that you find out about that suddenly you have to spend money to fix. So this can be something as simple as the toilets. That happened to me. One of the toilets hadn't been replaced in 40 years and cost us $600 in a water bill because we didn't realize it was running 24/7. Or it can be something like an HVAC or even a roof. So you really have to be aware that there's some big maintenance expenses that often are not included in an ROI on a home that you're going to be responsible for as the homeowner. Let's talk about renting. What are the pros and cons of renting? Well, the pros with renting is that if you have terrible neighbors or you have a decline in the attractiveness of the neighborhood, or you want to move to a new school district for your kids, or you want to move across the country for a new job opportunity, getting out of a rental contract is relatively easy. Usually the worst case scenario is you might have to pay 1 or 2 months rent as a penalty to break the lease. You can negotiate that with your landlord, and it gives you lots of flexibility and options in your life. And when you're young, having options is tremendous. And just giving you flexibility, that's the best thing about renting a space. Some of the cons of renting is rents go up with inflation over time. And what we're finding during the pandemic is with the lack of housing supply, rental demand is still very strong. And landlords know that they can charge a whole lot more for people to live in their places. So that can become unaffordable over time, and you're not building equity or any kind of price appreciation that you own. You're not building any asset in that. So those are some of the pros and cons of renting. Which one should you do as a student loan borrower? Well, it's going to depend a lot on a couple questions that you need to ask yourself. One is, how long are you going to be staying in an area? So are you going to be somewhere at least 5 years? If the answer is yes, in most markets around the country, it would still make sense to buy a house. If the answer is no, in most markets around the country, it probably means that you should not buy a house. If you are living in a place like Omaha, Nebraska, it's probably a lot better idea to buy instead of rent if you're going to be there for a few years. In San Francisco, regardless if you're going to be there 20 years, it probably does not make sense to buy a house, at least financially. The reason for this is something called price to rent ratio. If you take the price of a house and divide by the annual rent, that gives you the price to rent ratio. So in a place like San Francisco, that ratio could be 50 or more. And that is so insane. That means it would essentially take you 50 years worth of rental payments to own a place. That doesn't make sense. That's not going to break even unless you have unless they discover gold in the streets of San Francisco and your share of the gold is, something that you own because you're the property owner, right? That's the only way owning a home makes sense in terms of the finances of it. In a place like other parts around the country, other places around the country, that break-even period might be quite a lot faster. So the price to rent ratio, that's just kind of a gauge to see how overvalued or undervalued a market is. If a place is under 20 on that ratio, it's probably a very reasonable place to buy. It probably makes a lot of financial sense to buy. If that ratio is over 30 or 40, then you're talking about a little bit more risky decision. So if, as a student loan borrower, can you still buy a home? The good news is FHA mortgages and other kinds of mortgages like Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae mortgages, they're going to look at your income-based payment monthly and calculating how much you can borrow. So they're not going to look at what they used to do, which is just what is 1% of your principal balance, that's what you have to pay every month, and they'll penalize you in that equation of calculating your mortgage limit. And then most people, if you have $400,000 in loans from vet school, would not be able to qualify for mortgage at all. With these new rules, with government mortgages at least, you're going to be able to qualify to buy a house. With a lot of banks that offer professional and physician mortgages, those banks also give very positive and generous treatment to student loans in terms of qualifying you for what you can afford. So you shouldn't really have too big of an issue getting a mortgage if you have student loans, unless you've refinanced like a 5-year term on a huge balance and then your payments could be a really high percent of your income. That's what you want to watch out for. So that's one reason why we kind of encourage people to refinance to longer terms if you're a home buyer, and people that use our studentloanplanner.com/refi refinancing links and get cash bonuses up to $1,000. That's what we kind of tell them to do, is maybe go for a more extended term with a refi, like a 20-year, while you're buying a house. And then once you've bought the house, you're more secure in your career, you made big prepayments on your student loans, then refinance it again to say a 10-year or a 5-year at that point versus up front. So there's a lot of different considerations when you're deciding, do you buy a house or rent? I'll tell you my situation. We bounced around the country. We weren't positive we wanted to stay for my wife's job in a particular city, so we rented for a long time. And then finally we decided to buy a house once my wife said it was time. So that was really the consideration, is lifestyle reasons, not financial reasons. And that's what I would suggest for you, is in trying to decide if you're ready to buy a home, make the decision based off of what's good for your personal life and not what the finances tell you, because the finances are that very few people get rich from home ownership. It's not something that you should plan to make a ton of money on. It's just something that people happen to make a lot of money on during the pandemic. So therefore you should be thinking about what's in the future, not what's in the past, because you can't go back and buy houses with prices from 5 years ago. So those are some considerations. Of course, if you wanted more of a custom look into your student loan plan and how house buying or renting makes an impact on that, you can book a call with studentloanplanner.com/book. Thank you everyone for watching, and until next time, post your questions in the comments.